Sikandar Ali was getting back to a home he shares with his father. Aimee Betro had been waiting in this parked car for 45 minutes. As he gets out of his car, she approaches pointing a firearm. You won't hear gunshots. That's because
She wasn't a local, and she wasn't a tourist. Aimee Betro arrived in Birmingham, England, with a purpose darker than anyone around her could have imagined. On the surface, she was just another American woman, confident, smiling, and blending easily into the city's busy streets. But behind the charm and the accent was a plan. And behind the plan was blood. Betro was no ordinary visitor. She was a contract killer. Hired from across the Atlantic, she came not for business, not for family, but to carry out a murder for hire. And when the job was done, her victim lay dead. Her employers thought they had silenced a problem, and Aimee returned to her life as if nothing had happened. But the truth has a way of surfacing. British investigators, working tirelessly, began to unravel the web of lies that had brought her into the country. They followed the trail, pieced together her movements, and uncovered the chilling details of how a paid assassin had been imported into the UK. The revelations shocked both sides of the Atlantic. To Americans, she was an embarrassment, an ordinary woman who had crossed a line few dare to imagine. To the British, she was something far rarer, an outsider who had come into their country to kill, exposing the reach of organized crime and the terrifying reality of contract killers. By the time she was arrested, her calm demeanor barely cracked. She acted as if the charges were just a misunderstanding, as if the weight of a murder plot wasn't bearing down on her. But in court, the mask fell. The evidence was overwhelming, the jury was unshaken, and the sentence was absolute. Life in prison. Who she was, the murder she was hired to commit, and what happened in her final 24 hours before the sentence that would define her life. This is the case of Aimee Betro, Birmingham's contract killer, and the American woman who crossed an ocean for murder. Aimee Betro was born and raised in the United States. To those who knew her growing up, there was nothing that immediately marked her as destined for infamy. She was described as sociable, intelligent, and ambitious, someone who seemed capable of building a successful, ordinary life. For years, she lived under the radar, blending into her community like anyone else. But beneath the surface, Aimee's choices began steering her toward darker paths. She developed a taste for fast living, for circles of influence and relationships that leaned heavily on money, power, and control. Friends would later recall that she was charismatic, able to talk her way into opportunities, but also reckless, someone who was drawn to risk. Over time, those risks pulled her closer to crime. Her associations shifted from average peers to people with records, connections, and dangerous reputations. She became linked to individuals who operated on the edge of the law, people who dealt not in ordinary jobs or businesses, but in intimidation, violence, and, as investigators would later prove, murder for hire. While her family life in America painted her as an ordinary woman, the reality was that Aimee had built a double image. On one side, she could present herself as trustworthy and approachable. On the other, she harbored the mindset of someone willing to cross any boundary if it meant money and influence. By the time she appeared in Birmingham, she had already made a decision that most people would never even entertain: to become a contract killer. She did not come by accident, nor by coincidence. She was recruited, chosen for her ability to blend in, and paid to carry out a task so cold that it required complete detachment. Her journey from a suburban upbringing in the United States to standing trial for murder in the United Kingdom would leave investigators stunned. How did a woman who could have pursued a normal life instead choose the path of professional violence? That question would haunt those who studied her case. What is clear is this: by the time Aimee Betro boarded a flight to Birmingham, she wasn't a tourist. She wasn't a visitor. She was an assassin, carrying the weight of a job that would leave one person dead, a family shattered, and two nations asking how far someone will go when greed overtakes humanity. The crime in 2007, Birmingham became the stage for a murder-for-hire plot that looked more like something out of a crime film than real life. At the center of it was Aimee Betro, the American woman flown in to carry out the job. The target was a local man caught in a web of disputes involving money, power, and dangerous associates. For the people who wanted him gone, hiring someone from outside the UK was calculated. A stranger would leave fewer ties, raise fewer suspicions, and walk away once the job was done. Aimee Betro was their answer. Witnesses would later describe how Aimee slipped into Birmingham quietly, her presence unnoticed. She blended in, walking the busy city streets, looking no different from a visitor or a student. But every step she took was measured, every move part of a plan she had been paid to execute. The attack came swiftly. Armed and prepared, Betro confronted her victim in a way that left no chance of survival. When the weapon was fired, the scene turned chaotic. A man was left dead. His life ended not by a rival or a known enemy, but by a woman flown in from across the Atlantic to pull the trigger. Neighbors who heard the gunshots at first thought it was fireworks. By the time police arrived, they found a trail of devastation. A body, terrified witnesses, and a community struggling to process how an American assassin had found her way to their streets. For Aimee, the job didn't end there. What shocked investigators was how calm she seemed afterward. She didn't act like a panicked criminal or someone haunted by what she had done. She acted like a professional, someone completing a task. She disappeared into the city, then made her way back toward her normal life, as though the murder had been nothing more than a transaction. But while she may have believed she had gotten away clean, the walls were already closing in. Forensics at the scene, witness descriptions, and surveillance evidence began to form a picture of who had been involved. Slowly, British police uncovered the shocking truth. This wasn't a local hit job. It was international, a plot that reached across borders. And at its center was Aimee Betro, a woman who had chosen to take a life in exchange for money. The crime left more than a body behind. It left a family mourning, a community shaken, and investigators determined to find the woman who had turned Birmingham into the stage for an international assassination. The investigation. The investigation into the Birmingham contract killing was one of the most complex the city had seen in years. Detectives quickly realized this was no ordinary crime. The murder had been executed with precision, the victim clearly targeted, and the attacker gone before most people even understood what had happened. At the crime scene, forensic teams worked meticulously. Bullet casings were collected, trajectories were mapped, and fingerprints were lifted from surrounding surfaces. Each piece of evidence told investigators the same story. This was not random violence. It was planned, organized, and carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Witnesses who had seen glimpses of the attacker described a woman, unusual in itself for a hit-style killing. She wasn't British, they said. Her accent was American. That detail immediately set the case apart. Who would bring in a foreigner to carry out a hit in Birmingham? And how had she been connected to the victim? Detectives began pulling hours of CCTV footage from cameras around the neighborhood. Frame by frame, they tracked a woman walking near the scene before and after the killing. She blended in with the crowd, but patterns emerged. The same hairstyle, the same clothing, the same calm demeanor. Within days, the blurry image of a suspect began to form. Behind the scenes, police reached out to U.S. authorities. Through international cooperation, they were able to identify her, Aimee Betro, an American citizen with no legitimate ties to Birmingham. Travel records showed she had flown into the UK shortly before the murder and left again not long after. The timeline matched perfectly with the crime. Detectives also traced her connections. Phone records, emails, and financial transactions linked her to individuals tied to the victim. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were people with motives, people who stood to gain from his death. And Aimee Betro was the one who had been paid to do their bidding. When the evidence was laid out, the picture was undeniable. This wasn't a random woman who had snapped under pressure. She was a hired gun, flown across the Atlantic to commit murder. The revelation shocked both British investigators and the public. The idea that someone had imported an American hitwoman to carry out a killing in the UK made headlines. It sounded like fiction, but the evidence was real, and it all pointed to Aimee Betro. By the time her name became public, she had already been tracked down. Authorities were ready to charge her with murder for hire, and the case against her was airtight. The investigation had peeled back the layers of deception, and at the center was the chilling truth. Aimee Betro was not just a visitor to Birmingham, she was an assassin. And she had been caught. Trial and sentencing. When Aimee Betro finally stood trial in the United Kingdom, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, and curious members of the public all gathered to witness a case that felt almost unreal. An American woman accused of traveling across the Atlantic to carry out a contract killing on British soil. The prosecution laid out its case with chilling clarity. They detailed how Betro had flown into the UK under the guise of an ordinary visitor. They showed the CCTV footage tracking her movements before and after the murder. They presented forensic evidence from the scene, bullet casings that matched the weapon linked to her, fingerprints, and digital records tying her to the people who had ordered the hit. But the most compelling element was the motive. Prosecutors told the jury that Betro had been paid to kill, that she was a hired gun motivated by money and loyalty to dangerous associates. They painted her as cold, methodical, and utterly indifferent to the life she had taken. To the prosecution, she was not a victim of circumstance or manipulation. She was a professional killer. The defense fought to change that narrative. They argued that Aimee was not a trained assassin, but an ordinary woman caught in circumstances beyond her control. They suggested she had been pressured, coerced, or manipulated into carrying out the crime. They tried to frame her as someone who had been used by men with power and influence, a pawn rather than a mastermind. But under cross-examination, the defense's arguments weakened. Prosecutors reminded jurors that Betro had choices at every stage: to fly to the UK, to meet with her employers, to carry out the killing, and to leave without remorse. None of those choices pointed to a woman under duress. They pointed to a woman fully aware of what she was doing. Throughout the trial, Betro's demeanor fascinated observers. She rarely showed emotion. Some days she appeared calm, even detached, as though the proceedings were happening to someone else. Other days, she watched intently, her eyes locked on the jury as if trying to read their reactions. But she never broke down, never displayed the kind of grief or regret jurors might have expected from someone accused of such a crime. The turning point came when the jury was shown the timeline: the flights, the payments, the surveillance footage, and the crime scene evidence. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed one image. Aimee Betro had traveled to Birmingham with the sole purpose of killing a man, and she had succeeded. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of carrying out a killing for hire. The sentencing followed swiftly. The judge addressed her directly, condemning her actions as one of the most cold-blooded cases the court had seen. He told her she had brought fear and violence into a community, all for money, and that her crime showed complete disregard for human life. The punishment was clear: life imprisonment. For the victim's family, the sentence brought a measure of justice, though no comfort could undo the loss. For the public, the case became a chilling reminder that even in modern Britain, contract killers still existed. And in this instance, one had been imported from overseas. As she was led away, Betro remained composed. No tears, no outburst, no visible remorse. Just the same calm mask she had worn throughout the trial. For many who watched, that final moment was the most haunting of all. Final 24 hours. The final 24 hours before Aimee Betro's sentencing were unlike anything most people will ever experience. While the world outside carried on, inside her cell she was left with only her thoughts and the knowledge that her fate would soon be sealed. Accounts from prison staff paint a picture of a woman who remained eerily calm. Unlike many prisoners awaiting a life-altering judgment, Betro showed no panic, no sleepless pacing, no collapse into despair. Instead, she stuck to routine. She ate the same basic prison meals, spoke little, and gave no indication of fear about what was to come. Guards noted how composed she seemed, almost as though she believed she could still talk her way out of the inevitable. That morning, she was prepared for court. Dressed plainly, with her hair pulled back, she gave off none of the glamour or confidence she once projected in public. Instead, she looked like what she had become: a prisoner waiting for the system to deliver its judgment. The ride to court was silent. No words, no questions. Observers later said she carried herself with a kind of cold detachment, as if this was simply another step in a process she had already accepted. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Families of the victim filled the benches, bracing themselves for the conclusion of a trial that had already dragged them through months of pain. Reporters sat ready, pens poised to record every word. And then Aimee entered, eyes forward, face unreadable. When the judge began his remarks, Betro didn't flinch. He recounted the evidence, the overwhelming case against her, and the cruelty of traveling across an ocean to carry out a murder for hire. He described her lack of remorse, her cold demeanor, and the irreparable harm she had caused. Finally, he announced the sentence, life imprisonment. In that moment, most eyes turned to Aimee, waiting for the crack in her mask. But there was none. No tears, no visible regret. Just the same calm, almost indifferent look she had carried throughout the proceedings. For the victim's family, that lack of emotion was almost as disturbing as the crime itself. Her final 24 hours ended not with drama or breakdown, but with quiet finality. A cell, a meal, a courtroom, and a life sentence. For Aimee Betro, the woman who once crossed the Atlantic as a contract killer, there would be no freedom, no escape, and no second chance. Aftermath and reflection. The sentencing of Aimee Betro marked the end of one of Britain's most unusual murder trials. For the people of Birmingham, the idea that a foreign hitwoman had walked their streets, carrying out a calculated killing for cash, was something out of a nightmare. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that shocked them, but the international nature of it. Someone had looked across the ocean and decided the best way to solve a problem was to import an assassin. The victim's family expressed relief at the life sentence, but their grief remained. No court verdict could restore what had been lost. What haunted them most was not only the violent way their loved one had been taken, but the knowledge that it had been done by someone who had no personal connection, a stranger paid to kill. In the United States, her story drew a different kind of attention. For many, Aimee Betro's case was a stain on America's image abroad. An ordinary woman turned contract killer, traveling to another country to execute a hit, left people questioning how greed and desperation could twist someone so far out of humanity. Law enforcement officials on both sides of the Atlantic pointed to the case as proof of the dangerous reach of organized crime. If someone could be flown in, kill, and leave without hesitation, it meant that networks capable of arranging such acts were alive and well, and far more global than most wanted to believe. For criminologists and the public alike, Betro became a case study in betrayal. She wasn't a hardened gang leader or a desperate addict lashing out in chaos. She was in many ways ordinary, a woman with choices who chose the darkest path possible. Today, she remains behind bars, serving out her life sentence. And her story remains a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't come with warnings or stereotypes. Sometimes it arrives on a plane, walks the streets unnoticed, and carries out its task with chilling precision. The name Aimee Betro will forever stand as a warning that contract killing is not fiction, and that those willing to sell their conscience for cash can come from anywhere, even across an ocean. The story of Aimee Betro is not just about one murder for hire in Birmingham. It is about the terrifying reality that someone can be brought in from another country, blend into a community, and end a life for money. It is about how greed and detachment can turn an ordinary person into a paid assassin. But now we want to hear from you. Do you believe Aimee Betro's life sentence was the right punishment, or should a contract killer who crosses borders to take a life face an even harsher penalty? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this case shocked you as much as it shocked us, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to the channel. We bring you more stories every week. Stories that reveal the darkest sides of human nature and the justice that follows. Your support helps us uncover these cases and keep the memory of the victims alive. So hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss a story.